welcome to this very special show on ET Now. As India and the world struggle for ideas on how to combat the unprecedented crisis following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we at ET Now are delighted to bring our viewers an interaction with Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, also former Governor Reserve Bank of India, former Chief Economic Advisor Government of India, and former Chief Economist International Monetary Fund, the youngest to be appointed to that post. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajan, for taking time out to speak with ET Now, and congratulations on your appointment to the IMF's External Advisory Group on key developments and policy issues, including responses to the exceptional challenges the world now faces due to the pandemic. In your blog post earlier this month, you described the COVID-19 crisis as the worst economic emergency for India since independence. But public policy decisions are all about trade-offs in the present context between saving lives and saving livelihoods. As someone who's been closely involved with public policy decisions during your stint, first as Chief Economic Advisor and then as Governor of Reserve Bank of India, where and how do you think we in India should draw the line? We've extended the lockdown to the 3rd of May, but what after that? Should we open up fully or continue with a phased exit? Dr. Rajan?
Well, obviously, people on the ground know far more about the situation than I do, but I think it's not a stark choice, saving lives or saving livelihoods. You have to actually do both. And that means that on the one hand, you can't remain in lockdown forever. That would be focusing only on saving lives. But in the process, if people don't have livelihoods, you may also impact their lives. And, we don't have distribution systems that reach everybody in India. Especially the very needy, the very poor, often they're left out of the distribution system. So we have to make a trade-off where we focus on both, but try and do a little bit of both at the same time. What that means is that we have to think about a staggered restarting of the economy, start first with the areas where it's least vulnerable, and then move to the areas where it's most vulnerable. But of course, what this means is an enormous amount of administration goes into the reopening, perhaps even more than fighting the disease.
So are these choices different for developing and developed economies? Do you believe, as some seem to do, that emerging markets don't have the luxury of large-scale spending unlike developed countries? Or are you with people like Dr. Rangarajan, who believe that this is not the time really to get obsessed with things like fiscal deficit? The fundamental principle of war finance, according to Dr. Rangarajan, is that nothing should be decided on the principle of finance. Would you agree with that assessment, Dr. Rajan?
He's actually very right. He's, of course, one of the doyens of central banking in India, somebody we all look up to. And I think the real point is this, that what matters is the health of the real economy. And no matter what the fiscal deficit numbers, etc., are, if you kill the health of the real economy, there's nothing to go back to. So the first focus should be on protecting the health of the real economy, which means protecting the health of people. After all, they are the central sort of source of wealth. Protecting social harmony during this time, because you want people to believe the government is really looking after them. And then, of course, protecting firms and financial institutions to make sure that when the economy starts up again, there is a healthy sort of structure that you can go back to. So, yes, you may have to spend. You want to spend as wisely as you can. You want to prioritize because there are some things you can do and some things that are extremely expensive. And yes, it would be nice to do it if you had plenty of resources, but you can't do it. So prioritize. The fiscal deficit numbers are going to look ugly, whatever you do. The important thing is to convince investors that this is necessary to keep the economy together. They can't complain about that because this is in their long-term interest also. But also signal that you will go back to fiscal discipline over the medium term. That's why, one of the things I think that's very important is to say that India will be different this time. Last time around, when we expanded the fiscal deficit after the global financial crisis, we took a long time to come back to normalcy, and we still aren't there, which is why we have limited resources at this point. But I think it would be important to signal that we'll do it reasonably fast after this particular episode, but don't constrain us right now when we're protecting the economy.
Yeah, that seems a very logical argument because in situations like this, do you believe that fiscal policy should lead with monetary policy at best lending support, instead of which what we're seeing is that most of the heavy lifting is being done by RBI and a relatively feeble response has come so far from government? How does our fiscal package, less than 1% of GDP, compare with global packages not only in the developed world but also in developing worlds? And what do you think is holding the government back?
Well, one has to be careful about all fiscal packages because some of them count loans as part of the package, and some of them double count stuff that was already in the works and count that as part of the fiscal package. There is some incentive to do shock and awe with the size of the fiscal package. So that, taking that into account, I mean, the reality is we need to have a priority list which we check off and do what is necessary. Make sure that everybody is fed in India for the first as the first point of action, and make sure that point zero is make sure that our medical facilities are well equipped with tests, with the equipment that they need to deal with the virus, that our administrative structures are in place to enforce quarantines, to do the tracking and tracing that is necessary, but also to ensure that everybody has the basic wherewithal to live through this process. The food, the shelter. So all that is necessary and has to be done. And I think that that is something that the state governments, the central government are trying to do. I can't tell you how successful they've been, but that's important. That is absolutely necessary at this point. Beyond that, the second step is to look at all our vulnerable firms, the small and medium enterprises, even some of the large firms, and to make sure that they can survive this process and be ready to reopen when, in fact, we point to a region and say you're relatively free of the virus and you can reopen. The third aspect is worry about the financial system and make sure the financial system is also working so that it doesn't freeze up the economy when the time comes. So all these three are necessary, and if we're not doing it, we should be.
You spoke of shock and awe, Raghu, but there is a view in government circles that India should adopt a very calibrated approach and not go in for the kind of big bang rescue, the kind of shock and awe that you spoke about. But will spending in drips and drabs serve the purpose, or should there be some critical mass? In which case, what is the quantum of additional spending or size of the fiscal deficit that we can live with without jeopardizing future macroeconomic stability completely? Because, as you said, that's very critical. So, what could that be? 5%, 6% of GDP?
It's hard to know, Michael, what is the level that ultimately it depends on whether you can do it without a collapse in the currency and a rapid increase in interest rates. We already see some increase in interest rates. Our currency is held up quite reasonably compared to some other emerging markets over this period. But that's a signal of whether the market is willing to accept your paper, and that's important because ultimately somebody has to finance this deficit if we increase the deficit. So the interest rate differential, for example, between government bonds and the money and the policy rate is one indicator of whether the market is increasingly reluctant to accept government paper. So what is important really at this time is to figure out your priority list. And, it turns out when you do the numbers that giving people, especially the needy, adequate means to live through this period is not that expensive, at least compared to the larger scheme of things. And in terms of the humanitarian benefit, the benefit in terms of social harmony, the benefit in allowing them to stay at home rather than come out on the streets because they have nothing to eat. All that is well worth the cost. So I think thinking about making sure that everyone, whether they have access to the public distribution system or not, is adequately fed and has the basic means of life. I think that's a no-brainer. The next issue is our small and medium enterprises, and there one of the big problems is, they are already on a sticky wicket. They are relatively fragile because of what has been happening in the past. And when some of them will be unable to survive. And it's certainly what you want to do is for the people who are running this, many one-person enterprises or household enterprises, you want to keep them with the first, that is the targeted transfers to individuals, targeted food to less well-off families. But you want to focus on protecting the valuable small and medium enterprises, the ones that have been profitable and will continue to be profitable if they survive this process. So, find different ways of access, of reaching them, and to the extent you can, provide support for them. And of course, we want to make sure that none of our large viable enterprises fail, and therefore, making sure that financing reaches them, for example, via the corporate bond market or via the large banks. I think that's also important. So you need to look at each part and see how much will it take, how can I make sure they survive, and more as important, how can I make sure they have financing to start up again when we restart the economy. Now, to some extent, this is work that should be ongoing, and it's partly a fiscal effort, partly something which the central bank is doing.
You spoke about the small and medium scale enterprises, and they are the most vulnerable part of our economy. Now, government wants businesses to keep employees on their payroll, but is that really feasible for the vast majority of these small businesses in particular? Unless government steps forward with some kind of support, maybe loans like the US payroll protection loan to industry, would that be feasible in the Indian context?
Well, again, you have to be very careful on structuring these schemes so that they minimize the amount of resources they need. As we've seen, the U.S. payroll protection program is now funded with something like $700 billion, which is approximately 3.5% of GDP. It ran out relatively quickly, and it is really something which is going to help these entities for about a couple of months. And we don't know what comes next. If the virus recurs, something similar will be required in order to have these firms keep on their employees. And despite that, U.S. unemployment is already 25 million new unemployed over the last few weeks. So these things can become enormously expensive if you try and keep the companies together over this period. There may be some reason to do that for certain companies, but ideally, what you would like to do is keep them in a state of suspended animation with relatively low outflow during this period, so that they can be revived when the time comes. Now, that's easier said than done. Does that mean that you lay off your employees? Well, in India, we don't have a strong system of unemployment insurance. So you would hope that the companies keep on their employees, even if perhaps at more moderate wages. But we need to think through cleverly through this, and where possible, find ways to alter the system so that these companies stay together, but the cost outflow for the companies is relatively minimized. Now, we've come up with things like moratoria on this and moratoria on that, but we also have to be careful that when you say, moratorium on rents, there's somebody receiving the rents who then has their own problems with cash flows. So we need to track this whole system through and make sure that everybody in the system is relatively able to sustain. So, this requires a lot of work, and I hope this work is ongoing.
Ultimately, it all comes down to how do we finance this kind of spending. Government has announced a number of measures to tighten its belt, but this is small change compared to the kind of money we need to spend. So, is this a time for unconventional measures, perhaps like RBI buying government securities in the primary market, essentially monetizing the deficit, maybe transfer of more reserves from the RBI's balance sheet, or maybe even a special bond or COVID bond, something like South Africa is attempting? What are the kind of unconventional measures we could possibly adopt without too much long term damage?
Well, I think anything you adopt during this time has to be seen as temporary and to deal with, one of the, as I've said, the greatest emergency India has faced. I think that therefore, you can be as unconventional as you want, but what you also have to remember is there's no such thing as a free lunch. Uh, Ultimately, you can join the balance sheets of the government and the RBI. That's the way to think about this. If we were to take the extreme step, what would we do? We would join the balance sheets of the government and the RBI. But when you consolidate the balance sheets, yes, the RBI can finance the government that's building up government assets on its side, but the RBI has to get financing from somewhere. And this is where people lapse too quickly into the idea that, the RBI can print money. Well, somebody has to hold the money. And today, there's about 21 lakh crores outstanding of currency in India. But how much more currency are people willing to hold? Presumably, maybe a lakh crore more. But that's about all the currency they're willing to hold, which means that if RBI is going to finance anything, it has to issue more reserves. And somebody has to hold those reserves. Now, banks already have excess reserves. They don't want to hold more reserves without getting some interest for it. So ultimately, what this boils down to is the RBI is going to borrow from the markets and essentially intermediate between the markets and whoever wants financing, whether it's the government, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the public sector. And of course, the RBI cannot lend directly in some cases. It has no ability to make commercial loans, but it can try and coax the banks to lend to those sectors and serve as sort of the intermediary in between. Now, what the US Treasury and the Fed have done is in cases where the central bank is taking some credit risk, the US Treasury indemnifies the central bank against that so that the US Treasury is effectively taking that credit risk. Now, we need to think about things like that if we want the RBI to serve more as an intermediary, basically intermediating between a banking system which won't make those loans and finding some way for those loans to go into the areas which are really necessary, whether it's state governments, whether it's the central government. And the RBI can expand its balance sheet for some time through this process, but there are limits to that also. So we have to be careful when we say monetize the deficit or print money. There are limits to doing that, and those limits are reached very quickly. What can be done is temporarily the RBI expands its balance sheet and holds more assets, broadens the set of assets willing to hold while making sure that it doesn't do anything it doesn't understand. It doesn't make direct loans because it has no ability to make those loans. It doesn't understand commercial credit risk. What it can do is refinance entities that can make those loans while taking minimal credit risk against them.
Well, the RBI has tried, in all fairness. It has in fact announced two packages today to support the economy, but frankly, neither has moved the needle as far as credit offtake is concerned. Banks remain highly risk averse and continue to park their excess funds with RBI. You said that RBI cannot lend directly as a Fed can, but can it do things like perhaps buying corporate bonds? Would that help make the system a little better?
It could, but it has to do it in a non-discriminatory way. Otherwise, it gets politicized very soon. It can't buy bonds of A and not of B, so it has to have a pretty clear metric. I will buy all bonds of this particular quality. But easier still would be to repo corporate bonds. That is, buy the corporate bonds temporarily off the balance sheets of some of our large insurance companies and pension funds, thereby giving them some liquidity to go out and buy something else. So effectively, the RBI is providing funding to those entities. It could similarly do that with the NBFCs, again, maintaining adequate haircut on the bonds that it buys so that it's not exposed to credit risk. But I think what is needed at this point is, the banking system is going to be very risk averse. It's not going to be willing to lend. So, some thought of whether the government should expand the guarantees it gives for some of the loans that the banking system makes. For example, I've said that perhaps it could think of guaranteeing loans to entities that made a significant profit last year, whether they're small or medium sized. And that would give the government a reason to lend to them because they are paying into the treasury. Yeah, and if they survive, could be expected to do that. But it also gives a clean metric. We will lend only to those who we will guarantee in a more significant way those entities, and therefore distributes these government guarantees in an objective way. Those are ideas that need to be thought of, need to be implemented soon because the system is hurting. And if it is paralyzed, it is going to be a real problem, even when we, open up, as you said earlier.
Absolutely. In fact, I think we're already quite late on all this because, unlike in 2008, this crisis has originated in the real sector. But now there's a fear of it spilling over to the financial sector. We've already seen a large mutual fund wind up six of its debt schemes, jolting investors. Should RBI come to the rescue of mutual funds like it did in 2008? Or should it take the view that mutual funds should live up to their name, their investments are subject to market risk, and there's no need for RBI to ride to their rescue? Can it afford to take that position?
Well, the problem is at times like this, all markets freeze up. And so, if you think of the central bank's essential function as providing liquidity, not taking credit risk, but providing liquidity, generally at times like this, you have to make money freely available. And that means entities which have frozen balance sheets, uh, even though the underlying value is reasonable in normal times, you have to help them unfreeze their balance sheets. So I think the opening a window again with minimizing the credit risk that the RBI takes, but willing to repo high quality assets to almost any registered reasonable financial institution, except the very very tiny. I think that we're very far from that. We could go further steps along that path, and it may be necessary at a time when the financial markets are freezing up. So I would think that one of the functions of a central bank at a time when markets are freezing up is to re-liquefy them. That's something the Federal Reserve did, last month, and it is something that there's increasing pressure on central banks around the world to do that, and it is a important function of a central bank.
Given the fact that demand pressures are going to be low for quite some time, can we relegate the growth inflation trade off to history books, at least temporarily? Is it time to rethink the inflation targeting regime? Because the MPC's
So
present mandate comes to an end middle of next year. So, should we rethink it at all?
I, I think let me go with your first point, which is that in general, during this crisis, because of the significant effects on incomes of large parts of the population, I think the general view, which I support, is that demand pressures or the demand compression is going to be greater in effect than the effects on supply. And so, to some extent, what we're going to get is disinflationary forces rather than inflationary forces. There will be areas of shortage. There will be areas where vegetable prices may pop up. But in general, I think it is depressing demand more than it will depress supply, and there are academic papers showing that. So given that, I would say you can still stay with an inflation targeting regime, and I don't want to talk specifically about Indian monetary policy, but more generally, uh, the inflation targeting regime is not going to be a constraint. I think, and this goes back to my earlier point, any institutional structures that India has which convince investors that over the medium term, financial stability, monetary stability, fiscal stability will be maintained is something we should emphasize at this point when we are breaking or the bounds this year for good reason. So if we break everything, if we break all discipline, then how do we convince investors? How do we convince people buying state government paper or central government paper that they should trust us to come back to the straight and narrow because we just broke all the institutions which will bring us to the straight and narrow? So I would say let's keep those institutions. In fact, strengthen our fiscal institutions, such as bringing in a fiscal commission and so on, but say, well, that's about getting us back to the medium term responsibility. In the short run, this is a crisis which requires special measures in order to protect the people and the economy, and we're going to do that.
Oh yes, this is very exceptional circumstance. So now let's shift to the oil market, Raghu. Low oil prices are normally very good news for India, given our huge dependence on imported oil. But low oil prices, if they are a sign of acute global distress, then it's quite possible that we might actually lose out more than we might gain as a result of the low oil prices. How do you see the fall in oil prices as a temporary aberration or a sign of a longer term worrying trend?
Well, I mean, look, the big change in the oil market has been the emergence of the United States as a big producer of oil. And that certainly, even in the last few years, has upset the tightness of the oil markets, which has been to our benefit. We've benefited enormously from the decline in oil prices, and that has helped our growth. I think going forward, given that the global sort of economic scenario is going to be one of a slow return to normalcy, I think we are going to see relatively depressed oil prices for some time, unless, and this is a question to keep in mind, that some of this disruption causes social sort of turmoil in some of the countries that have low oil prices, because a lot of them have survived by buying off their population. If it creates social turmoil in some of the oil producers and takes them off the grid, so to speak, that could have create problems down the line from the supply side. But I think for the foreseeable future, the kind of supply cuts that OPEC is willing to make, non-OPEC is willing to make, are too small to ensure that the oil price goes back to something that producers and consumers feel comfortable with, which is about $50 to $60 a barrel. It will take some time to get there, which is a windfall for us, no matter how you spin it, which we should be thankful for.
According to the IMF, the world economy faces the worst depression perhaps since the Great Depression, with output shrinking 3%, though India and China are expected to show positive growth. How seriously should we take these estimates today, given that we're nowhere near seeing the end of the pandemic? And dare I say it, could the recession tip into a depression, which is a sustained long-term decline? Economic activities across a number of economies. It's not entirely out of the realm of possibility, or is that too dire a scenario?
No, look, I am in the camp which has grown progressively more and more pessimistic about the outlook, both for the world as well as specific countries. I think that as we learn more about this, first, we realize it's much more widespread than we think. And second, it has much more adverse consequences. Uh, China is struggling to get back to normalcy. Uh, it's brought production back quite a bit, but it has two problems. One, the service sector, which is in China, a growing part of the economy. It's hard to get the high contact services back up. The restaurants, the hospitality, they are making efforts. They are distancing. They have this app which allows them to, identify contacts, etc. But even they are struggling to get back to normalcy. And of course, with the production side, their problem is demand in the rest of the world is very weak. So nobody wants to buy stuff apart from masks and ventilators in a big way. So demand is depressed for them. And so some industries may come back, but it will take time. And of course, the process of the rest of the world coming back online is going to be a slow and steady one. So the damage in terms of firms that are killed off during this process is going to be there. Unemployment is going to go high, come down quite rapidly, but stay at much higher rates than the 3.5, for example, that we were used to in the United States. It will take a fair amount of time to get back to normal. And of course, at the end of this, we have both enormous levels of debt that have built up in the global economy, whether it's government debt or corporate debt or even household debt. but we also will have a significant amount of distrust that we have to overcome between countries, kinds of policies that were emerging before the coronavirus crisis, but even the kind of policies during the crisis with every country for itself. So I am more pessimistic. I think the good news about humans is when things are really down, they find sort of the ability to come back together, and I hope that's true of India as well as of the world. But it is a huge challenge, and that's why I was very clear in my in a piece I wrote in the Times of India that this is the crisis of our times for India.
You mentioned China, Raghu. How do you see the geopolitical dynamics between US and China play out in the post-COVID world? And can India leverage the growing distrust between these two countries to our advantage?
It's it's rarely to anyone's advantage to enter a quarrel. You tend to actually get flack from both sides. I think India has correctly been staying out of the quarrel between the two countries. It is it is a quarrel about each country's image, right? The U.S. thinks it's still the most powerful economy and military power in the world, and doesn't find the idea that there's another country coming to challenge it acceptable. And both sides, Democrats and Republicans in the United States, don't necessarily believe that they should cede more space to China. And any administration, whether Democrat or Republican, would think that if China overtakes it on any of these dimensions, while it is in power, that would be a failure. So they're not willing to accept that maybe they need to share the space now. And from China's side, it doesn't understand as well that people fear the system, fear a authoritarian system coming in, and are not as happy. They prefer a democratic system in the U.S., even led by a Donald Trump, to a system they simply don't understand in China. And China has to establish its credentials over time, and it will. But it has to do it in a non-prickly way, the way that it has developed military sort of antagonism, territorial antagonisms with all its neighbors, is something that a lot of countries around the world look at and get worried about. So each country has to do some lifting. The U.S. To show that it can be reliable once again, and China to show that it too can be depended upon, and it too will not turn on other countries. So this is going to play out. The issue is, can it play out amicably without finding pawns to fight their wars, as happened during the Cold War, or will it sort of descend into hotter wars across the globe? And we have to see how that happens. I do hope that they find a modus vivendi, and also we develop new rules of the game. And I think the US presidential election is probably the most important event over the next decade, because it will determine the identity of the person in the White House, as well as the way the US behaves. Not so much that it'll change US's views overnight, but it will change the tenor of the discussion.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, which brings me to my next question. After the 2008 crisis, we saw a great deal of global cooperation in trying to revive the global economy. But this time, we're really not seeing that kind of interest from the global community at large. Even the G20, they've come out with a statement, but that's largely just words. Is it a reflection of the kind of presidency we have in the US?
Almost surely. Well, to some extent, I won't put all the blame on the US. It's a general deterioration in global cooperation and global leadership. And, that has been some time in building. I think, if you recall 2009, it was Gordon Brown who sort of banged heads together in the G20 to get a massive response across countries. And I think that today there is really nobody who can fill that position. Boris Johnson just was ill. The head of the G20 is Saudi Arabia, which has its own problems. And many countries are looking inwards. And, to some extent, that's understandable. They're trying to catch up with the virus. Many of them are behind the curve and trying to catch up. But you would hope that people would look out for the rest of the world, because the kinds of problems when the emerging markets and the developing countries get this virus is really horrendous. I mean, in a sense, if it expands at the pace it expanded in Italy and the United States, we have a huge humanitarian disaster which is going to face us as it expands through Africa. So, we're way behind the curve in preparation, but we're way behind the curve in response also.
In a federal structure like ours, the bulk of the spending has to be done by states. And while there has been an increase in the states' ways and means advances, this is unlikely to suffice. What more can the union government do? Should it increase the fiscal deficit target, maybe borrow more and on lend to states? More importantly, should it allow states greater flexibility to do whatever they can? Because the ground realities are so different in each state. Because as you wrote in your same blog post, if the government insists on driving everything from the Prime Minister's office with the same overworked people, it will do too little, too late. Is that the fair assessment?
Well, I would repeat what I've been saying for some time, which is we need to decentralize and use the talents, the undoubted talents that exist in India. I mean, draw on the private sector to help you in this process. Uh, you know, uh, Decentralized to the states. We have a lot of able chief ministers who can do more. For everything to be controlled by the center determining more minor details is just impossible at this time. So you need all the help. You need everybody to be enlisted in this process domestically, and I think that that's something that goes without saying. Um, I do hope that we can roll out measures, the ones that we have talked about, because the longer the economy stays without this kind of support, the weaker it gets, the more that has to be done to get it back to the same place.
Oh, absolutely. I think, as I said, I think we've already lost precious time. And the fact is that each of our states is so different. We really are, in fact, we're a union of states more than the typical federal republic, not so much centralized. So we do need to give states much more flexibility. But one of our strengths really today is our huge forex reserves of close to 470 billion. How can we best leverage this?
Well, I would say that it gives people comfort. One reason our currency hasn't plummeted the way Brazil's has or Mexico's has is presumably because people look at our large foreign exchange reserves and our low current account deficit, in fact, possibly a surplus this year, and say, well, on the external front, India is okay. That's great. And again, it goes back to my point. Let's not spoil the things that are good. Let's not now say, okay, we're going to take these foreign exchange reserves and sell them in the global markets so that we can get money back to do something else. That keep it as a reserve. Focus on the things that you can do. Again, I think follow Dr. Rangarajan's principles. Spend where you need to spend. Uh, it's hard for us to say we'll spend what it takes because we may not have all that it takes to bail everybody out like the Western countries. But we certainly can spend where it is necessary, where it is warranted to keep the economy together, and have these structures in place that protect us. They are the things that will allow us to do this while we do the actions that are necessary. And, I don't. We sort of latch on to some of these structures and say, oh, why don't we break inflation targeting? Why don't we sort of consume all our reserves? We're not there yet. Let's focus on the other stuff that needs to be done, which is probably more important at this point.
Sure, and we've been talking all this while a very bleak present scenario. So let me now move to the kind of recovery that the world and India can expect. What kind of recovery can we expect? Will it be V-shaped or will it be a much slower, drawn-out recovery?
Well, I think anybody who hoped for a V-shaped recovery is probably in a very small minority right now, because we recognize we don't have a vaccine, we don't have even enough testing, right? We don't know which are the areas that are relatively virus-free, and there we have to think about more innovative ways of testing, mass testing, for example, that has sometimes been proposed. But we need to essentially ramp up this process. And we need to do a staggered opening. That will take time. We will find there are bottlenecks we didn't anticipate. I mean, think about a supply chain running through India. If one state opens, but the other state doesn't open, or that part of the supply chain is in an area which will be open, geographic or production area which will be open much later. Uh, Supply chains can't function. So you need to think through all this. Requires an enormous amount of administrative effort, uh, but it means that things are going to open up more slowly. So is it U-shaped? Is it going to be W-shaped, which means another dip as we see the virus pick up again? The reality is nobody knows. What we need to do is do what is obvious at this point, and keep doing it. Keep making sure that we can do everything that is within our powers, and hope that in a sense we've done too much, and eventually we come out on the other side fine. So I would say it's going to be bad. It's going to be really bad. We need to worry about whether this moves from just the real sector to the financial sector. So we need to do a lot to try and restart the economy as soon as reasonably safe. We can't be perfectly safe, but as soon as reasonably safe. And we need to focus on removing the bottlenecks that will surely show up as we open up the economy. But it's going to be a process of muddling through, of dealing with challenge after challenge after challenge, which comes up in places we don't see. There'll be lots of black swans, but hopefully we will come through all this.
I'm now coming to my second last question, Raghu. I know we've kept you for a long time, but just the second last question is, even if we go through all this pain, what are the key lessons that India perhaps needs to learn from this entire COVID experience? Public health, certainly, but what else?
Well, I mean, public health is the obvious one where we need to ramp up, but we also need to think about why we enter this crisis with limited resources, with a more fragile system, which then implies that we can't spend the post-COVID uh, um, period with the kind of low growth we've had in the past, with the kind of financial fragility we've had, with the kind of fiscal tensions we've had. And so I really think we need to think about a new covenant for India. How do we, generate the kind of growth we had in the first few years of this century? How do we go back to strong, sustainable growth? And that may require significant reforms. India, in the old way, simply doesn't cut it. And I think thinking about what those reforms will be and how do we build the political consensus to make that happen is really the central question. Because otherwise, we will crawl along in a very ineffective way, something which we simply cannot afford given our young population.
Oh, absolutely. You've given us a lot of food for thought. But my last question, and this is really on a lighter note. You took over as governor during the days of the taper tantrum. And life for an RBI governor, increasingly, it seems, is a bit like being on a roller coaster. So are you missing all the action, or are you relieved that you don't have to wrestle and lose sleep over questions for which really nobody has any answers, at least not at this moment, Raghu?
No, I don't envy the people who are dealing with this. It is extremely tense. It is nerve wracking. You have no idea whether anything you implement will work. And there are more and more problems that hit you every day. I remember after the taper tantrum, a friend saw me at an airport and he said, "What happened to you? You look as if you've aged 10 years." I mean, it does take a toll. And I don't envy anybody who's dealing with this. They deserve all our thanks. It's an extremely important job that they're doing. They get a lot of criticism, but really, it is very important that they do it, and they get all the help they can.
Absolutely. Uneasy lies ahead that wears a crown. But thank you so much, Raghu. It's always a delight to speak with you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. And I'm sure our viewers have really enjoyed this discussion with you. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.